Hi everyone, so today we're going to be looking at sexual reproduction, and then we're also going to be looking at asexual reproduction in the second part of this video. So the study design dot points want you to know the biological advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction and the biological advantages of sexual reproduction in terms of genetic diversity of offspring, as well as the biological importance of genetic diversity within a species or population. So we're going to go into that now. I want to start with firstly having you understand what a gene pool is. So when we talk about gene pools, we're talking about the total number of genes and alleles within a specific population or a species at a certain time. So the larger the gene pool is, the greater the variety of genes and alleles in the population. If we have a small gene pool, we have a less variety of genes and alleles in the population. As you can see here, we've got a population of pigs. All their genes or their alleles are in this pool, and this would be considered the gene pool. So all the diversity in terms of the genetic alleles in that population. Genetic diversity is increased by sexual reproduction for a few different reasons. We've got the combination of gametes. So we've got the sperm and the egg combining different alleles. We've got random mating, independent assortment of chromosomes during meiosis, as well as crossing over of chromosomes, which causes recombination of recombinant chromatids. And all of this increases genetic diversity. What is sexual reproduction? Well, it is the fusion of two haploid gamete cells to form a diploid zygote. So this fusion of male and female gametes results in fertilization, whether that's in animals or that's in plants. So in animals, we have egg and sperm. These are haploid gametes, meaning they only contain one set of chromosomes. They fuse together and result in a fertilized egg, which we also call a zygote. And now this zygote is diploid because it has two sets of chromosomes. The same thing can occur in plants. We've got pollen, which fertilizes the ovule, which is the egg, and produces a fertilized egg, which is a seed, which we'll get into later on. As we go through the different examples of sexual reproduction, I want you to be thinking about the biological advantages and biological disadvantages of each type of sexual reproduction. First, we have oviparity. So ovi refers to eggs, or ovo refers to eggs. So in this type of sexual reproduction, eggs are released into the external environment and the embryo develops from nutrients inside the yolk, which you would all be familiar with if you've eaten eggs. And so this requires a significant amount of energy to produce an egg, firstly, with the nutrients by the mother. So the mother is producing using a lot of energy to produce this egg. There is little development inside the mother. Most of the development occurs externally. So eggs like this or eggs like this, the offspring are developing externally rather than internally. And fertilization, however, can occur inside the mother, or it can occur outside the mother. So in the case of chickens, the fertilization, so the egg and the sperm fuse together inside the mother. The mother then lays the fertilized egg, which develops into offspring. Or in some fish, the mother will lay eggs and the father will secrete the sperm onto the eggs, which then fertilizes the eggs externally and then develops into offspring. Viviparity is when the embryo develops inside the mother's body. So this is what happens with us. The offspring are born after a period of development called gestation. So this period of development varies depending on the organism. So for example, rabbits have a very short gestation period of only 4 to 5 weeks. Humans have 40 weeks. Horses are even longer, so 50 weeks. And elephants are very long. It's the longest gestation period, and they are 95 weeks. So a elephant offspring will stay inside its mother for 95 weeks, which is a very long time, and then it is born. Obviously, there are biological advantages and disadvantages for the length of gestation, and I want you to think about that. Why would it be advantageous for a rabbit to only have 4 to 5 weeks of gestation, and what are the disadvantages of that as well? Or what are the advantages of an elephant having a very, very long gestation period, and what are the disadvantages of this too? So with this type of sexual reproduction, fertilization occurs inside the mother. So the egg and sperm are fused inside the mother, and most mammals develop inside a fluid-filled sac inside the mother's uterus, as you can see here with this horse and with humans. Now we have ovoviviparity. So ovo is egg, vivi is used for live birth, and this is a mix of both. So we have an embryo developing inside an egg, and that egg remains inside the mother. So then the offspring will hatch from that egg inside the mother, and then the mother will give live birth. So this happens in very few animals, some snakes and some sharks. Pretty interesting. Think about why that might be beneficial, why it might have disadvantages again. Lastly, we have plants, and plants can reproduce sexually as well. So the plants that can reproduce sexually are called angiosperms. They are flowering plants, and they reproduce via pollination. So pollination is when the pollen, so the male gamete, fuses with the ovule, which is the female gamete. So we've got pollen over here. This is the stamen, which is the male part of the plant. That is then taken to another plant, which has different chromosomes, and it fertilizes the ovule, which is inside this female part of the plant called the pistil, and we have a fertilized embryo, which we call a seed, and that seed can then grow into a mature plant. Now this process of taking pollen, so the male gamete, to another plant to fertilize the ovule requires external factors such as birds, insects that are attracted to these brightly colored petals. They will maybe take some nectar, travel from one plant, go to another plant. They're not doing this on purpose, but just the act of them moving between plants helps the pollen travel to the ovule of another plant to reproduce sexually. These are called biotic factors, so it's when a living thing facilitates this pollination. Other factors, other abiotic factors rather, non-living factors, so wind or water can also help the pollen travel to the ovule. Now we're going to look at asexual reproduction, and so as we go through this, I also want you thinking about the biological advantages and disadvantages of each type of asexual reproduction. Firstly, what is asexual reproduction? It is when an organism can reproduce without a mate, so they reproduce on their own. There is no fusion of gametes, and all offspring that are produced as a result of asexual reproduction are genetically identical to their parent, so we call them clones. So there is no recombination of chromosomes. It is simply the parent producing offspring that is genetically completely identical to them. The first example of asexual reproduction that I want you to know is binary fission, and we've looked at this before, and this is how prokaryotes such as bacteria reproduce. However, there are some eukaryotes like amoeba and algae that also reproduce via binary fission, and so this is when one parent cell splits into two genetically identical daughter cells, and the DNA inside this parent cell is replicated, as you can see here, before splitting. So these two daughter cells genetically identical to this parent cell. On this next slide, I've got a video of bacteria reproducing via binary fission, and it's pretty interesting. It goes for about a minute, so have a watch. As you can see, we started off with just 2 bacteria, I believe, and after about 3 hours, you can see how many that we have. And so the process of binary fission is incredibly quick and produces a lot of offspring. The second type of asexual reproduction that I want you to know is budding. And so budding happens in simple organisms such as yeast, sponges, worms, jellyfish, hydra, and corals. And it is when the parent forms a bud which detaches and develops into its own organism. So example, we have a hydra here. It's developing a bud on the side, it grows and then detaches, and this bud will become its own organism. And this offspring, of course, is genetically identical to its parent. Again, I have another video of some coral doing this. Goes for about a minute again, so enjoy. Now we have fragmentation. And so fragmentation happens in simple organisms, again, like worms, sea stars, and some plants. And the parent breaks into fragments and develops into separate genetically identical organisms. And each fragment regenerates into its own organism. So here we have a planaria, which is a type of worm. This planaria is going to split into three. And then each of these three parts is going to regenerate into a whole organism. So each part will grow into a full organism. And now you have three daughter planaria, all genetically identical to this parent. These organisms, I think, are pretty cute, as you can see from this video of them moving around. Again, I've got another video of some sea stars that are reproducing via fragmentation. Next, we have vegetative propagation, which all of you are probably familiar with, but just don't know the term for. And this is what happens when plants reproduce without seeds. And so part of the plant or a cutting, for example, breaks away and becomes a separate genetically identical plant. So we've got a part that breaks away, becomes a whole new plant. If you've ever seen some potatoes, you do this. If you've left some potatoes in your cupboard for too long, they might start growing like this. These parts will break away and become their own plant that is genetically identical to the parent. So in this video here, you're going to see how this works. Usually plants will do this on their own, so it doesn't involve human interaction. But obviously I couldn't get a video of a plant doing it on its own. So this guy is going to propagate a plant, and these plants that he grows are going to be genetically identical to that parent plant. Next, we have sporogenesis. So this is what happens, or rather how fungi, algae, some algae, and mold and some plants can reproduce asexually. So a spore, so a unicellular haploid unit, so this only contains one set of chromosomes, forms on the surface of the parent organism, like this mushroom here, or fungi. Those spores are then dispersed into the surroundings. They start to grow, and they form their own organisms that are also haploid, but they are multicellular. This video I think is really cool. Doesn't really show much of the process, but it is a fungi dispersing its spores into its environment, and so all those tiny little dots are those haploid units, and those haploid units will then start to germinate in the surrounding area and form their own, become their own organism, and that is genetically identical to this parent plant here. I just think it's really beautiful to see. Lastly, we have parthenogenesis, which is a really interesting type of asexual reproduction, and this occurs a lot in animals that have been living in enclosures such as zoos for many, many years without a mate. And so the female will produce a gamete that develops without fertilization from a male. And so that gamete, that offspring, is genetically identical to the female parent. So it has the parent's 2 sets of chromosomes, that female parent's 2 sets of chromosomes. And this occurs naturally in invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, plants, and several fish. However, there are no known cases of parthenogenesis in mammals, which I think is pretty interesting. Recently, there was a case of a stingray that underwent parthenogenesis, and so this stingray was alone in an enclosure at an aquarium. It was with some sharks, and so one day the aquarium staff noticed that the stingray was pregnant, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, how did this stingray become pregnant on its own? There are no other male stingray in the enclosure. People were saying it might have been the sharks that impregnated the stingray, which is of course not possible because they're 2 different species. However, what was found was that this stingray was pregnant because of parthenogenesis. So this stingray was undergoing asexual reproduction. There was no fertilization by a male, and the offspring would be genetically identical to that mother. However, unfortunately, the stingray did not survive, but if it did and it produced the pups, they would be genetically identical to that mother stingray. As you can see from this diagram, you can quite quickly tell that asexual reproduction can occur on a much larger scale than sexual reproduction. It occurs much faster and produces more offspring. Sexual reproduction produces less offspring, but we are getting recombination, we are getting genetic diversity, or we're increasing genetic diversity in the population. Whereas asexual reproduction, all the offspring are clones, and so we are not increasing genetic diversity, we're actually hindering genetic diversity. Here is a little summary of the strengths and the weaknesses of sexual and asexual reproduction, because I wanted you to think about the biological advantages and disadvantages of each type of reproduction that we went through. So for sexual reproduction, some of the strengths is that it increases genetic diversity and it reduces the birth defects, risk of birth defects and genetic diseases. Whereas a weakness would be it's very time consuming and energetically expensive. So you think about those elephants that have a gestation period of 90 something weeks. That's very time consuming, costs a lot of energy. Whereas asexual reproduction, a strength is that it's frequent and energy sparing, meaning it doesn't require a lot of energy. It's fine tuned to thrive in a steady environment as offspring are cloned. So if the environment stays the same, those clones will be best suited to that environment because that parent has survived in that environment. A weakness, however, it hinders genetic diversity because we're not getting any new alleles in the population where the gene pool stays the same. We're not increasing genetic diversity, we're actually hindering it. As usual, I'm going to leave you with this meme. Please write down any questions and I will see you in class.